All right, can everybody hear me? Good. I was hoping I'll be able to walk around a little bit. So you heard that bio, but there's always like a but to that or an and. So yes, I've achieved all these things, but I also grew up in a single parent home. I also didn't decide to go to college until the week before college started. I got kicked out of, I lost my scholarship to college and had to work really hard to get that back. Only got into one graduate program to get my doctorate. And so like I did a lot of struggling as well. And so it's just kind of something to note is that while you hear all these really awesome things that we've all accomplished, there's like an end to all of these stories. So I want to get it out the way. You might look up here and say, gosh, that dude looks really familiar. There's some NBA player. He plays for the Rockets. Dude looks like James Harden, right? So let's just get that out the way. Yes, I look like James Harden. We are not related. My goal today is to talk about this idea of kicking the door down. Okay, say that with me now, kicking the door down. All right, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means as our time goes on. So there's a story I want to share with you all first. I've had the opportunity to go all over the country, all over the world to just do different things related to mental health and to really helping folks be their best selves. And one of the places where I landed was in Senegal. Senegal is on the western coast of Africa, and while I was there, I had the opportunity to visit a slave fort. So if anybody's kind of familiar with how slavery worked, right, a lot of folks came from one side of Africa, were marched all the way across Africa, and then went on the boats on these forts that were along the coast. So as I was at this fort, I had the opportunity to stand in this door called the Door of No Return. Why this door was so interesting is because for a lot of our ancestors, this was the last time that they would step foot on African soil before they would be put on boats and then sent to the various Americas. And so it was very interesting for me to stand at that door because that meant that at some point in time, hundreds of years ago, my ancestor walked through that door thinking that they would never, ever see Africa again. And so how interesting was it that I was able to stand at that door to complete that cycle, to say that although my ancestor walked through that door thinking that they wouldn't come back, I do believe that they knew that one day I would stand at that door and be able to say that we accomplished something and that their strength mattered. So I want to talk about this idea of doors and what this looks like for us. So there's this quote by Carter G. Woodson, and if you don't know who he is the founder of the precursor to Black History Month. At that time, it was referred to as Negro Week. He has this quote that says, "If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself with what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one." So if we think about where folks see us, they see us at the back door, right? They see that we have created this space where we are inferior and where we are justly outcast. And so I want to talk about three different things to help us to think through how can we kick that back door down. First, we must define what that back door is. Next, we have to reclaim our narrative. And then we have to find ways to share that message with other folks that look like us. So a group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to town, but none of them were aware of its shape or form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must expect it and know it and touch it, by which we are capable to do." So they sought out, and when they found it, they started to feel around. In the case of the first person whose hand reached the ear, he said, "This seems like a fan." As for another person whose hand was upon his leg, they said, "The elephant is a pillar, like a tree trunk." The blind man who placed his hand upon his side saw the elephant is a wall, And lastly, another one who felt his tail described it as a rope. During this conference, we are all seeking to explore and understand the various ways that society sees us as males of color, the consequences of this gaze, and ways to see ourselves differently. Many people have sought to describe how they see the experience of males of color as reflected in film, media, and print. However, similar to the blind men, society has fallen woefully short in adequately defining the varying lived experiences across males of color from different groups. Instead, males of color have been reduced to caricatures such as Sambos, scary black males, criminal rapists for Latinos. And these ways of thinking about males of color have led to the perpetuation of a false narrative, such as we have no history prior to colonization or slavery, that all roads for black males and for males of color lead to prison, that males of color are absentee fathers, and that we are apathetic and unmotivated to succeed. As reflected in that quote that I noted before by Dr. Woodson, the constant exposure to these narratives is intentional and designed to communicate an inferior status. It's designed to constantly keep us at that back door. Furthermore, due to internalized racism, conflict with societal expectations, this ideal of rigid masculinity, and peer groups that have low standards for acceptance but high standards for staying in the group, many males of color are seeking the various back doors that have been built to oppress us. So let's talk about what that defining the back door looks like. I'm going to talk about what this looks like from an educational standpoint, from a physical health standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, in regards to employment, and then lastly, just talking about what this means for us from a criminal justice standpoint. So I do a lot of work in the educational setting, and one of the things that's constantly talked about is the disproportionate number of males of color that are involved in disciplinary proceedings. So there was a study that was done. Now I'm going from memory now. Yes, memory. All right, so there was a study that was done that looked at 72,000 schools. And what they wanted to discover was what is the disproportionate amount of black males or males of color that are involved in disciplinary processes. And so what this looks like is expulsions, suspensions, and detentions. And what they found is that of those 72,000 schools, black folks made up 18% of the population. However, they made up over 40% of all expulsions, suspensions, and detentions. But what they also discovered is that there was same rates of disciplinary, of bad behavior, if you will, between both groups, but one was extremely disciplined more than the other. And so what they noticed is that a lot of that has to do with teacher perception. So there was another study that was done that looked at this ideal of who's disciplined the most. And what actually turns out is that black males who also identify with the learning disability are the ones that receive the majority of our disciplinary proceedings. So while we are overrepresented in disciplinary processes, we're actually underrepresented when it comes to being in gifted programs, even though we have the same intellectual capacity as our white colleagues. So that's something for us to note, is that there's something about the education setting that is defining us as intellectually inferior. When it comes to this idea of physical health, there are two peaks in terms of when black males die the most. Between the ages of 18 and 24, and then in our mid-50s. So as it stands right now, between the ages of 18 and 24, murders, accidents, and now suicides are the leading causes of death for that population. And actually, suicides used to be nowhere on the list, but now more and more black males are killing themselves at higher rates, right? And so that's something for us to know. And so if you're able to make it past your 24th birthday, So excited. I'm 24. I made it, right? You're essentially guaranteed to live another 25 years. But then there's something that happens to us in our 50s where we die off at a greater rate once again. And this is from stress, this is from diabetes, and this is from high blood pressure. And so we've defined the back door as poor educational attainment, but we've also defined the back door as challenges when it comes to our physical health. Another thing for us to think about is that for a lot of us, especially black males, one of the challenges that we're experiencing is talking about issues related to mental health. So suicide is on the rise for black men and males, but then also depression is on the rise as well. So it is not okay in our society for a black male, for a male of color to be sad. We're not allowed to do that. And so because of that, what we see more of is folks being irritable and being angry because we're allowed to be those things because no black man, no male of color is allowed to be sad and to cry and do those things. And what we discovered is that the rates of sadness and of depression for black males and for other males of color has quadrupled in the last 20 years. So there are more sad males of color, and then there are more males of color that are feeling hopeless and helpless. Also, something to think about, and this is my putting my psychologist hat on, is that black males, males of color, the two groups together are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. They're more likely to be diagnosed with behavioral issues, so conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, but they're less likely to be diagnosed with mood-related issues such as depression or anxiety. If we think about why that is or what that might mean, there's a difference between intentional perceptions of our behavior and unintentional perceptions of our behavior. So if I see someone as depressed and anxious, I'm I'm less likely to think they're being intentional in nature. But if I see them being their behaviors as being related to oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, I'm gonna see them more likely as being intentional in their behaviors. And for a lot of males of color, folks see us as someone that is just an intentionally bad person, right? So we have poor educational attainment, we have issues related to physical and mental health, and the people in general just think that we're bad people, right? Especially in the school setting. So when we think about this idea of unemployment and underemployment, here there was an article that came out that talked about this the epidemic that's occurring in Chicago, where they talk about how 45% of black men in Chicago between the ages of 20 and 24 are neither working nor in school in 2017, and that 20% of Latino men were also involved in this, were out of work and were not in school. And so the challenge with all of that is that these are due to racism. This is due to a limited investment in our communities to make sure that we have access to good jobs. And it's also due to a lack of connections. So a lot of us get our positions, a lot of us get into our jobs because of the people that we know. But it's really challenging to know people if people are unwilling to know you. I also just want to talk about this idea of the criminal justice system and the challenges that has had for us. So I do a lot of work with public defenders. I've written a lot around challenges that males of color are experiencing in the criminal justice space. And as it stands right now, males of color make up 60% of our prison population. 60%, right? But black men specifically make up 49% of those individuals who were wrongfully convicted. And if you factor in both black women, Latino men, and women, taxpayers have wasted over $1 billion wrongfully incarcerating persons of color. So while we might say that there's something criminal about black people, about persons of color, specifically males of color, we also have to acknowledge the fact that we are incarcerating wrongfully many people who have not done anything wrong. Another thing for us to know when it comes to the criminal justice system is that many of those individuals are actually parents, and that's not something that we typically take into account. 92% of the parents that are in prison right now are fathers. Those are black men and those are Latino men who have a high school education, who are unmarried, but have children that they're looking to take care of once they leave. Another thing for us to think about is this idea of, well, what does it mean to be a male of color, right? So society has made has given us certain expectations of what it means to be a male of color. So we have to be um, strong, we have to be unemotional, we have to be hypersexual, we have to be hyper aggressive. These are all things that we're required to be in order to really reclaim ourselves as men. Because one of the challenges with all of that is that for our various males of color, the first thing society has done to us is try to strip us of our manhood at various spaces. So either by calling us weak, either by taking our families away and saying that we can't do anything about it, by psychologically saying that we are not men, and then not allowing us to achieve those things that we typically hold men accountable for, such as providing for their families and protecting their families. So the challenge with all of that is that we are oftentimes left to live up to these expectations that society has said that we need to, but is also saying that they will find ways to ensure that we won't live up to those expectations too. And so there's a conflict that we experience where we try to say that, like, gosh, really wish I could live up to these things. I really wish I could be employed. I really wish I could protect my family. I really wish I could be out here doing these things that I've been told that a man is supposed to do. And then we experience something called gender role conflict when we are unable to achieve those things that folks said that we're supposed to be able to do. And there's like a whole lot of research that's talked about how that can help lead to issues related to depression and issues related to anxiety, because we feel sad and we feel anxious that we're unable to live up to society's expectations of what it means to be a man. Another thing for us to think about is rigid masculinity. So oftentimes in society that we are often told that there's only one way to be a man in the world. We're oftentimes told that you have to follow this script that's been given to you by society, and if you deviate from that, then something must be wrong with you, right? So either you have to be an athlete, you have to be an entertainer, you have to be a big, strong person, you have to be a scary person, you have to be these types of things, because if you don't, then you're not considered a man at that point. But one of the things I want to offer up in this space is that if you look around the room, there are a lot of men, there are a lot of males in here, and we are all really different. And how we perform and express that masculinity is different from all of us, or for all of us, and that's how things should be. There isn't a one-size-fits-all way of understanding what it means to be a man. And if anybody tells you that, it's not right, and it's actually very harmful to our mental health to do so. The last thing I want to think about in terms of expectations related to our masculinity is this idea of generational trauma. So I moved around a lot because that's what you do when you're in school and all of that, which means I've had to do a lot of unpacking and packing of boxes. And if we think about how a lot of males of color have been taught to deal with problems, it's through this big old long term called compartmentalization. And what compartmentalization essentially means is that you experience something and you say, I'm going to deal with that later, I'm going to put it to the side. And that's something that we've learned for over generations and generations and generations, from slavery and colonization, that those are the best ways to deal with problems, right? If you see something bad happen to someone, then I need to just shut that off and put that to the side. The challenge with that way of coping with things is that we've actually never as a society, never as various groups, ever revisited those boxes. And so by not revisiting those boxes, we're all carrying around a lot of trauma that other folks have experienced in our lives and that have experienced in our families that no one has really dealt with. And what the science tells us is that by not dealing with those traumas and not by dealing with those things that are in those boxes, then that leads to depression, that leads to anxiety-related issues, that leads us to not being able to relate as well as we would like to folks that are similar to us, as well as to those folks that are different from us. And so one of the things that we need to think about is how can we unpack those boxes? How can we look inside and think through what are the traumas that our various peoples have, what have they experienced, and what can we do about those? So what's waiting at the back door for males of color is a limited narrative that suggests that we should see ourselves as struggling physically and mentally, to be afraid to step into the conditions that have traumatized our various peoples in the form of institutional, cultural, and individual racism, that we are undereducated and underemployed, and that every day is just another step closer to our inevitable fate, which is to take up residence in one of the fine suites of the prison industrial complex. However, we are more and have accomplished more and have had to overcome more than what these statistics suggest. But to fully realize this, we must reclaim our narrative, conquer the enemy within, and strengthen our connections with other males of color. So as I alluded to before, starting this conversation, it hasn't been a very easy road for me to get here. You see all these degrees, you see, I've written 4 books, went to Harvard, I'm an assistant professor now, I'm one of very few black psychologists in the entire state of Kentucky. I've had a pretty successful run to be the age that I am. But it hasn't always been that way. So how many of you all have ever met a black male doctor before being in this space? So a little handful of folks. All right. So I didn't meet my first black male doctor until I was a junior in college. I didn't even know it was possible for me to be a black male doctor of any type until I saw that person, right? Because I had grown up in an environment where the only thing that I saw that I could be was an athlete, right? Because that's where my cousins were, that's where all the people around me were, that's what I was told that I needed to do as well. And so by meeting that black male doctor, I realized that I could do the same thing that he is doing. Because there's this phrase that goes, what they see is what they'll be. And so if I could see myself being a black doctor by seeing someone that also was a black doctor, that really helped bridge the gap for me. So how I got into this idea of psychology, because that's what I do for a living. I'm a psychologist that specializes in working with black men and males, is that I worked at a foster care center. And while I was there, one of the things I noticed is that almost all of the kids were black and brown kids, right? So these were kids that had been kicked out of their homes because people felt like they couldn't take care of them anymore, or they had been abandoned by their parents. One of the things that I noticed is that I had absolutely no skill in working with these kids. I was a junior in college. I was a psychology major, but they hadn't taught us about how do you work with a kid that has experienced all the atrocities that have happened to these young folks. And so I realized I needed to go back to school to really learn how to develop those skills. Another thing that I noticed is that a lot of the kids wanted to come home with me. They'd be like, Mr. Steve, can you come hang out with us? Can we go home with you? And I'd be like, man, I'm in this 500 square foot apartment that I'm barely making ends meet. I ain't got no room for you, homie. And so what I decided to do at that point is that I was going to go back to school and get my doctorate, which I did. And then when I was financially able, that I will go back and actually get some of those kids. And that's actually what I'm doing now. So I'm a foster parent, right? So not only am I a psychologist, but I'm a foster parent that takes in those kids that I hope to be able to take care of when I was a young adult. And so one of the reasons why I tell you that story is because this part, we're talking about this idea of reclaiming narrative, right? So the environments that I grew up in, one of the reasons why I didn't apply to school until the weekend before school started is because no one actually told me that I could go to school, right? Here I am, a doctor, 4 degrees, 4 books, and I could have been at home chilling because someone hadn't told me that I had the capacity to do all the things I'm doing now. So we have our opportunity to reclaim that narrative. I shared all of those depressing statistics with you, but those are just that. Those are stats, right? Those are things that might encompass some of our realities, but we all have the ability to overcome whatever that is. Because I grew up in the same environments. I grew up in the same type of single-parent households. I grew up in a lot of those things. But because I was able to see myself and other black males, that allowed me the opportunity to think that I could do more than I potentially could have been doing. And so I'm hoping by me standing up here and sharing that narrative with you, and also by just sharing the fact that I am a Black doctor, none of you all will be able to leave this space saying I've never met one, right? And so I'm hoping that that will be beneficial to you. Another thing for us to think about is that in order for us to address a lot of the statistics that I shared with you and a lot of the challenges that we're having as males of color, is to think about how we've internalized some of the things that society has said about us. So I do a lot of consultation work with school districts, and I remember one time I was working with some first graders. And these were all little Black kids, just being happy, being Black kids. And I noticed that there was a young male that was reading off to the side. And I noticed that some of the kids actually came over and started chastising that kid. And they would say, you know, we don't read. That's something that white people do. Right? We don't do that. And so like in that moment, I started to reflect, how did we get to that space where we associate certain things with whiteness that are also aspects of success, right? So if I get a doctorate, does that mean that I'm acting white? If I know how to read well, does that mean I'm acting white? If I can code switch between Black vernacular and educational language, does that mean that I'm engaging in whiteness? Like, so what is that about? And so in order for us to really address those things, we have to call what it is, and that's internalized racism, right? We've internalized that there's a certain way that we're supposed to be in life, and we can't be no other way. And so in order for us to address the internalized racism, there's this African proverb that says, if you conquer the enemy within, the enemy without can do you no harm, right? So there are so many things that impact us in society as males of color. But if we're able to conquer that enemy within, that internalized racism, then that enemy without, all those environmental things that we're exposed to, will do us no harm. Also, I had the opportunity to go to South Africa, and while I was there, I came across the Zulu tribe, Zulu folks, and they have a greeting over there called Sawubona. And what Sawubona means is I see you, right? That's how folks say hello, is I see you. And if we think about what that means in the context of our conversation today and of our conference, that's essentially what we're asking for in this space, is to be seen for who we are and how we define ourselves, not necessarily how society defines ourselves. Because we wouldn't even have that movie, there wouldn't even be a need for it if someone had seen a Black person or a male of color for how they saw themselves as opposed to how society saw them. So in order for us to be able to reclaim the narrative, we have to conquer that enemy within, which is internalized racism. And then we also have to be able to see each other and to be able to see ourselves for how we determine that, now how society says that we should be. Also thinking about this idea of sharing the message. So I've highlighted a whole bunch of stats. I've also talked about how we can reclaim our narratives so we don't have to sit at that back door. The next thing that we have to do is take this information and share with those folks that are not here in this space. And so there are three things here that I want to make sure that you share with folks in your circles of influence. The first one is realizing that there is a need to flexibly perform our masculinity, right? So every male of color in here is a different male of color, and that's how things should be. We shouldn't all be the same, and there shouldn't be one script that we use to determine whether or not someone is being a male or not. Right? However we perform it is how we perform it. Another thing to pass along is that it is okay to not be okay. Right? It is okay to not be okay. For a lot of males of color, asking for help is a no-no. Right? We've been taught by our peers, we've been taught by other males in our lives that you never ask for help because help is a sign of weakness. I'm a really smart dude. I've did pretty well for myself. I have not gotten to this space without asking for help. There is no way that anybody gets to any place in life without asking for help. And actually, if you identify as a male of color, it's almost a mandate for you to do so based on your cultural background, because we come from cultures that say that we always reach back to pull others forward because it's our responsibility as males of color. The last thing is to remember to help other males to be seen and to see those males for how they choose to be seen. So, kind of as a recap here, the way that we kick the door down is by remembering that quote, right? Society has told us that we need to be at the back door, that we need to build up that back door, and we need to constantly be in this space of inferiority. But there's a choice there. We don't have to be at that back door. We can literally kick it down. Know that you have the power to reclaim your narrative as a male of color and your ability to tell your story of being seen and conquering that socially constructed enemy within. Know that we have a collective responsibility to each other, to lift each other up, to help each other to be seen, and to see ourselves as well. And then lastly here, I just want to leave you with a couple of affirmations to think about why it's so special to be a male of color. The first thing is that you matter. I don't care what society has said about you. Society has tried to devalue you. Society has tried to tell you that you're dumb. Society has tried to tell you that you're deviant. Society has tried to tell you that you're dangerous. But you matter. Because if nothing else, you matter to me. Truly know yourself, and no enemy within or without can conquer you. Right? So if you know who you are, regardless of what society says about you, it doesn't matter, because your foundation is built and rooted in your perception, not society's perception of you. Remember, you are enough just how you are. So whatever society tells you that you need to be over here and you need to accomplish all these things and to do all of that, you are enough just the way that you are and just for who you are. Remember, you are here for a purpose, and your purpose is for your people. Muhammad Ali, I'm from the city of Louisville, has this quote that says that service is the rent that you pay for your time here on earth. It's no accident that you're here. It is a statistical improbability for you to be sitting in this space, right? And so that must mean that you are here for a purpose. It is up to you, in coordination with all of us, to help you to discover what that purpose is and allow us to be part of that process for you. Remember, society doesn't define you. You define your racial background however you determine it should be. There's no one way to be black. There's no one way to be Latino. There's no one way to be Asian, etc. You are you, however you define what that is for you. Remember, your history started before slavery and before colonization, right? So if we stick with just the slave narrative, that makes us think that we've just always been in this space of suffering. But actually, there are times even now where we have been the center of education, of achievement, of business, of financial prosperity, of mathematics, etc. And these have been the cornerstones of our peoples. And so remember that your history started prior to all of this, and that you should learn what that history is. Remember, once again, it is okay to not be okay, right? So most of the folks that come to see me have spent too long trying to be okay when they weren't, as opposed to just coming in when that first not okay happened, okay? Also remember that it is okay to cry. I realize that that's kind of like a weird thing to say, but it is okay to cry, okay? So males, shedding tears is just fine. And it doesn't have to be just in the sports context. Then lastly, remember, you've been given the resiliency of your ancestors in your DNA. If you identify as a male of color in here, all of your ancestors had to overcome racism, discrimination, second-class citizenship, murder, slavery, colonization. They had to overcome so much stuff in order to get to where they were, which means that you have that in you at any given time, and that's something that you can tap into in order to become the person that you choose to be, however you choose to do it. So remember, you matter. Know yourself. Know that you are enough. Know that you're here for a purpose. Know that you define you for you. Know that your history started way before this whole slavery or colonization thing happened. Know that it's okay not to be okay, and that with that, it's okay to cry too. And know that you are resilient and can overcome any challenge that stands in your way. Thank you.
Now, I bring speakers to our events that can engage with you. So we have the 2 microphones in the audience for you all to ask questions. So this is your opportunity to ask questions of Dr. Kniffley about his topic and just other things you may be curious about. So let's take advantage of this moment. Questions. Go to the microphone.
Hi, Dr. Stephen. Thank you.
Just call me Stephen.
All right, Stephen.
Yeah.
My name is Spencer Cotton. I work throughout the south suburbs in Thornton Township, and I'm also a family stabilization specialist for a foster care agency. My question for you is, I mentor a black male. He's 16, through a foster care agency, and the foster parents are burnt out. They're kind of at the end of the ropes, and they had them for about 7 years now, but they really just don't know what the next steps is to keep them motivated. What advice do you think I could, bring to them? And he's going through some challenges, but what advice do you think I can give them, or support I can give them to be a better foster parent?
So the first thing I want to say is thank you for what you do. As a foster parent myself, I literally couldn't do the things that I do if it wasn't for folks that do what you all do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The first question I will ask you is the young man in any sort of counseling?
That I do not. I'm not aware about that fully, but he does have like a social worker, one-on-one social worker that works with him weekly.
Okay, and so I will find out what's going on, if that's actual therapy or if that's kind of like a check-in, because those are 2 different things. So is someone just making sure that he's getting his basic needs met, which might be what the social worker is doing, or is someone actively working with him on the various challenges that he's experiencing himself? And so if that's not happening, I would recommend that'd be the first thing that you do, is to seek out a therapist for him, someone that can work with him. Whenever we're dealing with folks that appear to be unmotivated, the first thing I'm wondering is, do we actually know, or does that person know themselves what they value in life? So I wonder what's important to him. Where does he hope to see himself in the next couple of years? And then, what steps does he think that he needs to do in order to accomplish that? And so that might be a part of the process, is to first explore with him, well, what's important? What are your values? And there's this technique is called a values card sort. If you just type online, you can find it. It's just a series of cards that just ask, that have different values on it that are important to folks. So being caring, being honest, being empathic, etc. And so what I would do is I would ask that black male, that male, to identify 3 things that are important to them, and to give me examples of behaviorally how they connect to each one of those. And then to talk about some conflicts that they might be experience. So I hear you saying that, but then I also hear your foster parents saying this too. And that conflict is what you can work on in therapy. And so I say that I care about folks, but then I disrespect my parents. Well, there's conflicts there. Mm-hmm. So let's work on helping reconcile your values with what your behaviors are. So find out if he's in therapy. If he's not in therapy, get him in therapy. If he is in therapy, help him to discover what his values and let that lead to what his goals are.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Terrell Steele. I'm in high school at Cremoni High School, and I was just like, I have like a good question. So as you can see, like with high school, you see like all like the violence that occurs like with fights occurring, gang activities, and students struggling to like pass high school. I was just wondering, do you know what advice you can like help give high schoolers to like help them succeed?
Yes. So I'll offer up a couple of things here. And this is like in hindsight, these are things that I wish I would have been able to tell myself. The first thing I think about is high school is only 4 years, right? And so typically when we're in high school, we think that this is our entire lives, and we kind of get like wrapped up in all of that. And when it comes to relationships, how people care, whether or not people care about us, things like that. And instead, what we should be thinking about is, what is that next step for me, and how can I get there? And so thinking through, is it college for me? And if college isn't for me, is it learning some sort of trade? And if not learning a trade isn't for you, is it developing some sort of business, like doing something that's going to help you to be successful in life? So remember, 4 years is 4 years. Also thinking through that in this time, your network is your net worth. So your network is your net worth. And so remembering that you need to start surrounding yourself with folks that are going to lift you up and not pull you down.
Yes, sir.
One of the challenges in our peer groups and in high school specifically is that in an effort to be liked by folks, we oftentimes reduce our standards to be around folks that maybe aren't really helpful for us. So like I know myself, I try to surround myself with people that are better than me in a lot of different areas because I know that they will help lift me up. Also thinking through that this is a helpful time for you to find mentorship. So one of the things I really wish I would have done is I wish I would have sought out a black guy who's doing what I wanted to do early on in life to be able to say that this is the steps that you need to go in order to get where you need to be. So mentorship, your network is your net worth. So surround yourself with people that are going to add value to you, not take value away. And then remember that high school is really only 4 years. And so you should be thinking about what is that next step for me and what do I need to do to achieve that?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Brother Kniffley, Mike Crawford, Kennedy King College. You spoke, and what resonated with me was this idea of this sense of agency that the brothers should take around both, as pertains to both manhood as well as their own racial identity. As a student affairs professional, I've often struggled with that in my many relationships that I built at the college, many institutions I worked at, with brothers who come in and they feel like they have to live up to some certain definition, both with manhood as well as with being a black or Latino male. Are there some tips that you can give to the brothers in developing that sense of agency in both respects, as far as it pertains to combating the things that they see in media, social media, with their friends, even with their families, even with their fathers, telling them that they have to be a certain way?
Sure. So the first thing here, thank you for your question, is to first know your history, right? So it makes me very sad when I go to elementary schools and I ask them to name 5 famous brown or black people, and all the people that they name are rappers or entertainers or some sort of like athlete, right? Males of color have did so much to impact this country and to impact the world, and it's sad that so many of those names go unrecognized because people just don't know who they are. So the first thing is to really just know your history. So go back and just think about who's some famous black males, brown males, Latino males, et cetera, that I haven't been exposed to that I can learn more about. Another thing that I would offer up is just to surround yourself with a lot of different males of color, right? So the environment that I grew up in, all the males were the same. They were athletes, Some of them had, criminal histories. A lot of them had substance abuse histories, etc. Like that, I was only exposed to one type of being a male. But then I got to college and I was able to expose myself to a whole bunch of different folks that were different because then that allowed me to say, gosh, I can be different. I can perform differently when it comes to how I think about my masculinity. So, know your history, explore your history, expose yourself to a variety of different types of men and males, and then also just be critical thinkers about what you see in the media. So I don't want to go all conspiracist here on you, but remember there is a concerted effort to define black men, brown men, etc., in a very narrow way. So I'll give you an example. Who do you think is the greatest consumers of hip hop music? Who listens to the most hip hop music? Is it black people? Is it Latino people? It's white men. White males are the greatest consumers, the largest consumers of hip hop music. Who is controlling who gets record deals and all of that? That's also white men, right? So white men are in control of the narrative that's being put down about brown and black men, and then white men are the ones that are listening to that narrative, which means that we are not the ones in control of how we're defining ourselves. So whenever you see on the TV or in the news or on the internet, et cetera, is a very concerted message to say that this is how you should be as a black or brown person. And so remember, like Dead Prez said, believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. And that is especially true when it comes to how folks define us in terms of our masculinity. So know your history, um, be critical thinkers of the media, and expose yourself to different types of black and brown men.
So my name is Robert Marshall. I've kind of been doing this work for a while. My question is kind of layered. So we have black and Latino males in the room. How do we, as men who are committed to bridging the gaps and and creating supportive services for men of color, how do we continue to bridge the gap between the black population and the Latino community as well? Because oftentimes when we come into spaces where we start having dialogue, it's the black community and kind of is an afterthought of the Latino experience. So how can we continue to bridge the gap? How can we also, or do you know of any resources that we can actually practically go to kind of do our part on teaching or learning the history of the Latino communities? There's so many of them, but because I know even in some states it's illegal to even teach Latino history, like I think it's Arizona. And so how do we bridge those gaps? And then on a lower level for our students, how do we teach them to continue to teach them to control their narrative and realize that the stories are similar?
So I'm a smart guy, but you also said a lot. So I'm gonna answer the first question, and then you can let me know what the other two questions were. So the first one was, how do we bridge that gap between black and Latino folks? Right. I think the first thing to think about is that we have a common struggle, right? And like recognizing what that is. So there's a concerted effort. It might look different in how it's communicated, but it's still for the same, which is to denigrate and to oppress males of various colors. And so we have to recognize that even if we think we're on opposite sides of the ship, we're all still on the same boat. And so we can either move in the same direction together, or we can attempt to just be at a standstill and not go anywhere. And so there's an opportunity for us to all work together because we have a common struggle in mind. And what was your second question?
So, do you know of any resources?
Yes. So there's a book. It's called. I believe the term is the book is called Latinx, and it's a very comprehensive book about the Latinx experience across a variety of different spaces. And so I found it to be a really good book. It's a white cover. It just says Latinx on the front.
Yeah, those are my questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm sorry. The
Sure.
last question was, how on the lower level do we teach the male students that we are empowering? How do we practically teach them to, as you said, reclaim their narrative, reclaim their story, and how do they now, in an age where content is always being developed, content is always being pushed out, how do we as men of color take back our narrative, but also share it?
Sure. So I think you have to constantly question what you're seeing. So one of the activities I do with a lot of the groups that I work with, is to have them Google black men or males and white men or males. And what you'll see is a stark difference. So if you Google black men, oftentimes one of the first couple images that you will see is like greased up, buff black dudes in underwear. Like that's usually what you see. But if you Google white men, what you'll typically see first is a guy in a suit and tie and a doctor's outfit, looking all professional and stuff. And so if by the simple nature of just asking what does a black man look like yields a very stereotypical image, we have to constantly be aware that even if that is just unintentional, right, that there's intentional messages that are being communicated all the time, and that we have to be aware of what those are. And so in order to really be empowered, we have to engage in some really significant critical thinking and constantly question, what is this message? What's the message here? What are they trying to say about me as a person of color? And what can I offer up in terms of my history and in terms of my lived experience to refute that? Yes, sir.
I was gonna ask you about you was talking about internal racism, like racism within, and I wanted to ask about how we fight against that, even though we got the media pushing that story or that idea onto us. How do we fight back against that? And you was talking about using our culture and our ancestors in history to fight against that narrative too.
For sure. So there are three ways that we have to learn how to fight that within. The first thing is to be sure of who we are as a racial person, right? So if I know who I am as a black person, it does not matter at all what anybody else tells about me as a black person because I know the truth. If someone comes up to me and says, "You're not a doctor," well, then I'll look at my wall and I'll say, "But this degree says that I am." So regardless of what you say, it doesn't matter, right? And so we have to be as sure in our racial identity as I am that I'm sure that I'm a doctor, right? And part of that has to be knowing our history, being exposed to our history, being exposed to a lot of different types of persons of color, et cetera. The next thing that we have to do is we have to learn skills to be able to combat against internalized racism. So for a lot of us, internalized racism shows up in the form called microaggressions. I don't know if anybody's familiar with what those are, but I think the young folks now are calling that gaslighting. Is that so? Just this idea that you offer up something about your experience and someone tells you that it's not true. So if I say that I experienced something that was racist and someone says, "Well, actually, no, you didn't," that's gaslighting. That's an example of what a microaggression is. Or if someone comes up and says, "How many kids do you have? Do you play basketball? I can't believe that you're a doctor," etc. Microaggression. So we have to know our history. We have to be sure of who we are as a black person. We then have to develop those skills to be able to combat against internalized racism, specifically in the form of microaggressions. So those would kind of be the two things I would offer up. Sure, yeah, go on.
And then for my second part, I'm talking about how we basically appreciate our ancestors and our history.
So how can we appreciate it?
Yeah.
So that looks differently for different folks. So there's two things I know that I specifically do. I have a whole bunch of tattoos, which is always why I have long sleeve shirts on in these spaces. And all of my tattoos are symbolic of things African related. And so like they're either a drinking symbols, there's something that allows me to have pride in who I am as a black person. Also, if you ever go to my office, I have black people stuff all over the place, right? So I have things that I've collected all over the world. I have books that are about black people. I have paintings that are about black people. I have things to let people know that I really care about being a black person. And so I think you have to find out for yourself what that looks like to be able to celebrate your ancestors. And so for some folks, that looks like tattoos. For others, that looks like collecting materials. For some folks, it just looks like reading and like being immersed in those cultures and doing things like that. Thank you for your questions. All right, so I think we have time for one more question. I'm looking for Dr. Clay here. Okay, all right. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Daniel. My first question is, how would you go about finding a great mentor? And my second question is, what types of mentors did you have as you were progressing through life?
So from, because I think these will go hand in hand. So from K through 12, I had no mentors, which is why I applied to college the weekend before college started, and then I ended up not doing well. But then when I got to college, my first real mentor was the guy that I met that was a black male doctor. And so the first thing that you could do is you can approach that person. But when you approach that person, you need to have an ideal in mind of how that person could be helpful to you. Right? A lot of mentor folks, a lot of folks that are looking to be mentors are also really busy people. And so you have to give them an idea of what it is that you want from them. So that could be a recommendation, that could be guidance in terms of like where to go for like a path in life. That could be help trying to secure resources or things like that, but you have to have an idea of what it is that you need from that person. I think another thing that you can do is find ways to determine how you want to communicate with that person. So find out, first offer up what it is that you need from them, then find out how often or what frequency that you would like to stay connected with them. So I know with my particular mentor in college, I try to meet with him at least once every week or so. And like that was like our set time, is I would come in, I would drop by his office, and I would say, hey, this is kind of what I have going on. And then the last thing I did is like finding ways to stay connected, like after you've met that goal, that milestone that you have. So first, determine what it is that you want from your mentor. Find out what that process looks like for you. Make sure that you explicitly communicate that to whoever you want to be your mentor. Find a frequent time or whatever frequency of time that you hope to meet with that person or connect with them, and make sure that that's part of your all's conversation. And then find out how you hope to stay connected to that person. So is it through email? Is it through phone? Like all these things can kind of like help out. And then the last thing is to have a plan, right? So like, how would you hope that person would help you? And then also think through what type of plan would you want that person to help you to create, to help you to move forward in life. So it's kind of like 4 different things to consider there. Did you get them all?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.